There is something about the way morning light falls across Wrigley Field that makes you believe in permanence, even when you know better. The ivy clings to the outfield walls like memory itself, green and stubborn, weathered by decades of Chicago winters, yet somehow eternal. This is where we begin, not with the beginning, but with the feeling of what endures, the Chicago Cubs, a name that carries the weight of seasons uncounted, of hopes deferred, and dreams passed down through generations like heirlooms, worn smooth by touching. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sound of a wooden bat meeting horsehide leather on an October afternoon in 1908. The crack echoes across the city, bouncing off the buildings that line Lake Michigan, reverberating through the hearts of men and women who have waited their entire lives for this moment. This is the sound of triumph, rare and precious as autumn gold. It would be 108 years before Chicago would hear it again. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, aren't we? Stories, real stories, don't begin at their most dramatic moments. They begin in the quiet spaces, in the decisions made by men whose names history will mostly forget, in the convergence of circumstance and dream that creates something larger than the sum of its parts. The Chicago Cubs began, as so many American stories do, with ambition and a leap of faith. It was 1870 when the Chicago White Stockings first took the field, though they bore little resemblance to the team we would come to know. The city itself was still dusting off the ashes of the Great Fire, still believing in its own resurrection, still building itself back brick by brick and dream by dream. In this context, baseball was more than entertainment. It was proof of life, evidence that a city could rise from catastrophe and find reasons to gather, to cheer, to hope. Picture the players of that era, if you will. Men with handlebar mustaches and wool uniforms that grew heavy with summer sweat. They played bare-handed, catching fastballs with palms that knew the sting of leather and the particular pain of a ball that takes an unexpected hop in the final moment before impact. Their gloves, when they finally began wearing them, were thin leather shells that offered more superstition than protection. But they played with a joy that was infectious, a love of the game that was pure in its simplicity. The National League was born in 1876, and with it came a kind of legitimacy that baseball had been reaching for since its earliest days in the sandlots and pastures of American towns. The Chicago White Stockings were charter members, founding fathers in their own right, though they could never have imagined the empire they were helping to build. Their owner was a man named William Hulbert, whose vision extended beyond the confines of any single season. He saw baseball as America's game, something that could unite a nation still healing from civil war, still learning what it meant to be whole. In those early years, the team was a reflection of the city itself, rough around the edges, unpolished but determined. They played their games at 23rd Street grounds, a wooden ballpark that creaked and swayed in Chicago winds, where spectators sat on bleachers that were little more than planks stretched across sawhorses. The smell of sawdust and peanuts mingled with the industrial perfume of the city, coal smoke and Lake Michigan brine, the metallic tang of progress and the sweet rot of the stockyards. Cap Anson arrived in 1876, and with him came the first taste of what greatness might feel like. He was a giant of a man, 6 feet tall in an era when that height marked you as exceptional. His hands were the size of dinner plates, and when he swung a bat, it whistled through the humid Chicago air with the authority of a man who had never doubted his own power. Anson would play for the White Stockings for 22 seasons, accumulating statistics that belonged more to legend than to the mundane world of box scores and batting averages. Under Anson's leadership, the White Stockings won 5 National League pennants in 7 years, from 1880 to 1886. These were the glory days, when victory felt as natural as sunrise, when the team's dominance was so complete that other cities began to resent Chicago's supremacy. But even in triumph, there were shadows gathering. Anson, for all his greatness as a player, carried within him the prejudices of his time. He was instrumental in enforcing baseball's color line, ensuring that the game remained segregated for decades to come. It's a reminder that heroes are complex creatures, that greatness in one arena doesn't guarantee virtue in another. The team underwent various name changes in those early decades: White Stockings, Colts, Orphans, each name reflecting a different phase of their evolution, a different attempt to capture their identity in words. But it wasn't until 1907 that they became the Cubs, a name that would stick like ivy to brick, growing more beautiful and more permanent with each passing season. The name Cubs was born from necessity rather than romance. When Frank Chance took over as player-manager in 1905, the team was young and relatively inexperienced. A sports writer, noting their youth and eagerness, began referring to them as Chance's Cubs, and the name caught hold in that mysterious way that the perfect name sometimes does. Suddenly and completely, as if it had always been waiting to be discovered. Frank Chance, Joe Tinker, and Johnny Evers. Say those names aloud and let them roll around in your mouth like wine. These were the men who would write the first golden chapter in Cubs history, though they could never have imagined the poetry that would surround their names decades later. Franklin Pierce Adams would immortalize them in 8 lines of verse that captured something essential about baseball's capacity for beauty. Trio of bear cubs and fleeter than birds, Tinker and Evers and Chance. But before the poetry came the baseball, and what baseball it was. The 1906 Cubs won 116 games, a National League record that stood alone in the record books like a monument to excellence. They won with a combination of pitching, defense, and an almost supernatural ability to find ways to win games that seemed lost. Mordecai, Three-Finger Brown, anchored a pitching staff that seemed capable of making opposing hitters look like schoolchildren. Brown had lost parts of 2 fingers in a childhood accident with a corn shredder, and somehow this disfigurement became his greatest asset. The ball came off his damaged hand with movement that defied physics and logic, dancing through the strike zone like something alive. Picture 3. Finger Brown on the mound at West Side Grounds, the Cubs' home from 1893 to 1915. The ballpark sat in a neighborhood that was equal parts Irish, German, and ambitious, where the smell of fresh bread from local bakeries mixed with the industrial perfume of a city that never stopped building itself toward something better. Brown would pause before each pitch, adjusting his cap with his damaged hand, and in that pause you could feel the entire city holding its breath. When he released the ball, it was with the authority of a man who had turned misfortune into art. The 1906 World Series should have been the Cubs' coronation. They faced the Chicago White Sox in the first and only All-Chicago World Series, a matchup that divided the city along lines that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with loyalty and love. The White Sox were the hitless wonders, a team that had backed into the American League pennant with a batting average that would embarrass a good high school team. The Cubs, meanwhile, had dominated the National League like no team before or since. But baseball, as Cubs fans would learn again and again over the next century, doesn't care about logic or justice or even excellence. The White Sox won the World Series in 6 games, shocking a city and planting the first seeds of what would become the most famous curse in sports history. Cubs fans would spend the next 108 years wondering what might have been, carrying the weight of that disappointment like a stone in their hearts. The 1907 season was the Cubs' chance at redemption, and they seized it with both hands. They won 107 games and swept the Detroit Tigers in the World Series, finally delivering a championship to the North Side. Ty Cobb, perhaps the most feared hitter of his generation, was held to a .200 batting average, neutralized by Cubs pitching and defense that bordered on the supernatural. The celebration that followed was everything a championship celebration should be: spontaneous, joyous, and tinged with the relief that comes from finally getting what you've worked so hard to achieve. The 1908 season would prove to be even more dramatic, though it nearly didn't happen at all. The Cubs found themselves in a 3-way pennant race with the New York Giants and Pittsburgh Pirates that wasn't decided until the very last day of the season. The pivotal moment came in a game against the Giants on September 23rd, in what would become known as the Merkle-Boner game. Fred Merkle, a 19-year-old Giants first baseman, failed to touch second base after what appeared to be a game-winning hit, and the Cubs' Johnny Evers noticed the oversight and forced him out. The game was ruled a tie, necessitating a playoff that the Cubs won, earning them the right to defend their World Series title. The 1908 World Series against the Detroit Tigers was a rematch of the previous year, but this time the stakes felt even higher. This wasn't just about winning, it was about establishing a dynasty, about proving that 1907 hadn't been a fluke. The Cubs won in 5 games, with Three-Finger Brown pitching a shutout in the clinching game. As the final out was recorded, Cubs fans allowed themselves to believe that this was just the beginning, that championships would come as regularly as Chicago winters. They were wrong, of course. They couldn't have known that they had just witnessed the last Cubs World Series victory for 108 years. Couldn't have imagined that their grandchildren's grandchildren would still be waiting for another championship. In that moment of triumph, with confetti falling like snow and the city celebrating deep into the night, the future seemed limitless. If you believe in curses, and after a century of Cubs baseball it's hard not to, then William "Billy Goat" Sionis planted the seeds of Chicago's suffering on October 6, 1945. Sionis owned the Billy Goat Tavern, a basement establishment that would later become famous for inspiring Saturday Night Live sketches. But on that autumn day, he was simply a man who loved his pet goat and his baseball team. Not necessarily in that order. Sionis had purchased 2 box seat tickets to Game 4 of the 1945 World Series between the Cubs and Detroit Tigers. One for himself, one for his goat, Murphy. The goat wore a blanket that read, "We got Detroit's goat," and Sionis was prepared to enjoy the game in the company of his unusual companion. But when they arrived at Wrigley Field, ushers refused to admit the goat, claiming that other fans had complained about the animal's odor. Sionis was furious. As he was escorted from the ballpark, he allegedly shouted, "Them Cubs, they ain't gonna win no more." Some versions of the story have him sending a telegram to Cubs owner Philip K. Wrigley that read, "You are going to lose this World Series, and you, are never going to win another World Series again because you insulted my GOAT. The Cubs lost Game 4. They lost the World Series, and for the next 71 years, they would not return to the Fall Classic. But to focus only on the supernatural is to miss the very human drama that unfolded in the decades that followed. The Cubs didn't lose because of a curse. They lost because of a combination of bad luck, worse management, and the cruel mathematics of baseball, where even the best teams fail more often than they succeed. The 1950s and 1960s were decades of almost unrelieved mediocrity. The Cubs developed a reputation as a team that played beautiful baseball in a beautiful ballpark and lost games with a consistency that was almost artistic. Wrigley Field became a destination for tourists who came to see the ivy and the manually operated scoreboard, who wanted to experience baseball as it had been played in their father's time. The losing was almost beside the point. Ernie Banks arrived in 1953, and with him came a joy so infectious that it transcended winning and losing. "Let's play too" became his catchphrase, an expression of pure love for the game that resonated far beyond the confines of Wrigley Field. Banks was a slight man who generated enormous power. A shortstop who hit 512 home runs over the course of a 19-year career, all of it spent with the Cubs. He won back-to-back National League MVP awards in 1958 and 1959, becoming the first player to win the award while playing for a team with a losing record. Banks embodied something essential about being a Cubs fan: the ability to find joy in the game itself, regardless of the outcome. He played with a smile that was genuine, a love that was unconditional. When he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1977, he said, "The only way I could have played for another team is if my name was thrown out of a hat, but it never was." This was loyalty elevated to the level of art. Ron Santo arrived in 1960, a third baseman who played with the passion of a fan and the skill of a craftsman. Santo was a diabetic at a time when the condition was far more difficult to manage, but he never let it slow him down. He would secretly inject insulin in the clubhouse between innings, hiding his condition because he feared it would end his career. Santo's heel click became a Wrigley Field tradition. After Cubs victories, he would jump and click his heels together as he ran to the clubhouse, a celebration so pure and spontaneous that it made losing hurt even more. The 1969 season was supposed to be different. The Cubs got off to a remarkable start, building what seemed like an insurmountable lead in the National League East. For 5 months, Chicago allowed itself to believe that this was finally the year, that the suffering would end, and the Cubs would return to the World Series for the first time since 1945. Leo Durocher managed the team with the intensity of a man who had won everywhere else and saw no reason why Chicago should be different. But the New York Mets had other ideas. The Miracle Mets, as they came to be known, caught fire in August and September, overtaking the Cubs and ultimately winning the World Series. Cubs fans watched their team collapse in real time, day by agonizing day, until what had seemed inevitable became impossible. The pain was exquisite and complete. The 1970s and 1980s were decades when Cubs fans learned to love the game for its own sake, because the alternative was to stop loving baseball altogether. These were the years when Wrigley Field became famous for being Wrigley Field. The ivy-covered walls, the manually operated scoreboard, the friendly confines where losing was elevated to an art form. The Cubs traded away their future with alarming regularity. They let Hall of Fame caliber players slip away while holding on to veterans past their prime. They made decisions that seemed designed to break their fans' hearts, and somehow, impossibly, those fans kept coming back. There's something to be said for loyalty that transcends results, for love that doesn't depend on being rewarded. Ryne Sandberg arrived in 1982, and suddenly the Cubs had something they hadn't possessed in years, a reason to believe in tomorrow. Sandberg was a second baseman who combined offensive production with defensive excellence, a player who made difficult plays look routine and routine plays look artistic. He won 9 Gold Gloves and was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2005. But statistics can't capture what it felt like to watch him turn a double play or stroke a line drive into the gap. The 1984 season felt like destiny unfolding in real time. The Cubs won the National League East for the first time since the division was created, powered by Sandberg's MVP season and a pitching staff that included Rick Sutcliffe, who went 16-1 after being acquired from Cleveland. Wrigley Field hosted its first postseason games since 1945, and the atmosphere was electric with possibility. The National League Championship Series against the San Diego Padres should have been a coronation. The Cubs won the first 2 games at home, needing just 1 victory in 3 games in San Diego to return to the World Series. But baseball doesn't care about should-haves and might-have-beens. The Padres won all 3 games in San Diego, denying the Cubs their first World Series appearance in 39 years. The loss was devastating in a way that transcended sports. Cubs fans had waited so long, had invested so much hope in that season, that the defeat felt personal. It was a reminder that being a Cubs fan meant learning to carry disappointment like a favorite sweater. Uncomfortable but familiar, something you couldn't quite bring yourself to throw away. The 1990s brought new hope and new heartbreak in equal measure. The Cubs moved into a new division, the NL Central, and suddenly found themselves competitive again. But competitive, Cubs fans learned, was almost worse than hopeless. When you're bad, at least you know where you stand. When you're almost good, every season becomes an exercise in sustained emotional torture. Sammy Sosa arrived as a skinny outfielder with potential, and by the late 1990s, he had transformed himself into one of baseball's most feared power hitters. The 1998 season was magical, as Sosa and Mark McGwire engaged in a home run chase that captivated the nation. Sosa hit 66 home runs, a total that would have broken Babe Ruth's record in any other year, but McGwire hit 70, and Sosa had to settle for being part of history rather than making it alone. But Sosa gave Cubs fans something they had been lacking for decades, a reason to turn on the television every day, knowing that something special might happen. His home run trot became iconic, the hop, skip, and jump to first base, the kiss blown to his mother, the chest-beating celebration that declared to the world that this moment, this homer, this joy belonged to Chicago. The early 2000s brought more almost moments. The 2003 season was perhaps the cruelest of all, as the Cubs came within 5 outs of reaching the World Series before everything fell apart in spectacular fashion. Game 6 of the NLCS against the Florida Marlins will forever be remembered for Steve Bartman, a Cubs fan whose instinctive reach for a foul ball has been blamed for the team's collapse. But blaming Bartman is too simple, too clean. The Cubs had opportunities to win that game and Game 7, and they failed to capitalize on them. That's not a curse. That's baseball. The Bartman incident became a symbol of everything that was wrong with Cubs fans' relationship with their team. Here was a man who loved the Cubs so much that he had season tickets behind home plate, and in one moment of fan instinct, he became the most hated man in Chicago. The treatment he received, death threats, having to go into hiding, becoming a pariah in his own city, said more about the pain of Cubs fans than it did about the reasons for the team's failures. In 2011, the Cubs hired Theo Epstein as president of baseball operations, and suddenly everything felt different. Epstein had already broken one curse, ending the Boston Red Sox's 86-year championship drought, and Cubs fans dared to hope that he might work the same magic on the north side of Chicago. Epstein's plan was both simple and radical. Tear the team down to its foundation and rebuild it the right way, with an emphasis on player development, advanced analytics, and an organizational culture that prioritized winning over everything else. It meant several years of historically bad baseball, seasons when the Cubs lost more than 100 games, and Wrigley Field felt more like a mausoleum than a ballpark. But slowly, quietly, the plan began to work. The Cubs accumulated young talent through the draft and international signings. They hired Joe Maddon as manager, bringing in a veteran presence who had won with unconventional methods. They made shrewd trades and free agent signings, building a roster that combined youth with experience, power with speed, offense with defense. Chris Bryant, Anthony Rizzo, Javier Baez, and Kyle Schwarber became the faces of the new Cubs, a group of young players who seemed to genuinely enjoy playing baseball together. They had fun in a way that Cubs teams hadn't had fun in years, celebrating home runs with elaborate rituals and embracing the pressure that came with playing for a franchise starved for success. The 2015 season was when Cubs fans first allowed themselves to believe that this time might be different. The Cubs won 97 games and swept the Pittsburgh Pirates in the NL wildcard game before falling to the New York Mets in the NLCS. But the loss didn't feel like the end of the world. It felt like a step along a journey that was finally headed in the right direction. The 2016 season began with expectations that would have crushed previous Cubs teams. But this group seemed to feed off the pressure, winning 103 games and earning home field advantage throughout the National League playoffs. They swept the San Francisco Giants in the NLDS and defeated the Los Angeles Dodgers in 6 games in the NLCS, setting up a World Series matchup with the Cleveland Indians. Game 1 of the 2016 World Series was everything Cubs fans had waited 71 years to see. Wrigley Field dressed in its October finest, with every seat filled and every heart pounding. The Cubs won 1-0 behind a masterful performance from John Lester, and for one night, it felt like the curse might finally be broken. But the Indians had other ideas. They won games 2, 3, and 4, taking a 3-1 series lead that felt all too familiar to Cubs fans who had lived through 1984 and 2003. Once again, the Cubs were on the brink of elimination, one loss away from another winter of wondering what might have been. Game 5 was a must-win for the Cubs, and they responded with their best performance of the series. Chris Bryant homered, Anthony Rizzo drove in runs, and the Cubs won 3-2, forcing the series back to Cleveland. Cubs fans allowed themselves to hope, but carefully, tentatively, like people who had been hurt too many times to trust completely. Game 6 in Cleveland was an elimination game for the Cubs, and they played like their lives depended on it. Jake Arrieta pitched 6 strong innings, the offense erupted for 9 runs, and the Cubs forced a decisive Game 7. For the first time since 1945, the Cubs would play a winner-take-all World Series game. Game 7 was everything a deciding game should be. Tense, dramatic, emotionally exhausting. The Cubs took an early 1-0 lead on a Dexter Fowler home run, the first leadoff homer in World Series Game 7 history. But the Indians tied it in the 3rd inning, and the game remained deadlocked through 6 innings. In the top of the 8th, the Cubs finally broke through. Kyle Schwarber doubled, Chris Bryant reached on an error, and Anthony Rizzo walked to load the bases. Ben Zobrist then delivered the biggest hit in Cubs history, a 2-run double that gave Chicago a 6-3 lead. Miguel Montero added an RBI single, and suddenly the Cubs led 7-3 with 6 outs to go. But this was still the Cubs, and nothing could be simple. The Indians scored twice in the bottom of the 8th, making it 7-5 and setting up a heart-stopping 9th inning. Then the rains came, a brief but intense downpour that delayed the game for 17 minutes and gave both teams time to think about what was at stake. When play resumed, Davis Ross led off the top of the 9th with a home run, his final swing in a brilliant career providing an exclamation point to the Cubs' championship dreams. Carl Edwards, Jr. gave up a run in the bottom of the 9th, making it 8-6, but Mike Montgomery got the final out on a ground ball to Chris Bryant at 3rd base. Bryant fielded the ball cleanly and threw to Anthony Rizzo at 1st base, and, as the ball nestled into Rizzo's glove, 108 years of suffering ended in an instant. The Chicago Cubs were World Series champions. The celebration that followed was everything Cubs fans had dreamed it would be and more. Players piled onto the field, tears streaming down their faces as they embraced each other and the moment they had worked their entire lives to achieve. Theo Epstein, the architect of the championship, stood in the Cleveland dugout with tears in his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what his team had accomplished. Back in Chicago, the city erupted in a celebration that had been building for more than a century. Fans poured out of bars and restaurants and homes, filling the streets around Wrigley Field and throughout the city. Perfect strangers embraced, united by their shared love for a team that had finally delivered the ultimate prize. The Cubs' victory parade 3 days later was attended by an estimated 5 million people, making it one of the largest gatherings in American history. Fans lined the streets from Wrigley Field to Grant Park, many of whom had been waiting their entire lives for this moment. There were fans who had attended the 1945 World Series as children, now in their 80s and 90s, finally seeing their team win it all. There were fans who brought pictures of deceased relatives, honoring parents and grandparents who had died, still believing that maybe next year would be the Cubs' year. The parade route was filled with tears of joy, with laughter that came from the deepest places in the human heart, with a sense of completion that transcended sports and touched something fundamental about hope and faith and the power of believing in something even when all evidence suggests you shouldn't. The 2016 World Series victory changed everything and nothing about being a Cubs fan. The curse was broken, the championship drought was over, but the team still had to play 162 games the next season and try to win them one by one. The Cubs returned to the postseason in 2017 and 2018, reaching the NLCS both times, but falling short of another World Series appearance. Some of the magic of 2016 was impossible to recapture. That team, that season, that World Series existed in a moment of perfect convergence. The right players, the right manager, the right organizational philosophy, all coming together at exactly the right time. Baseball history is filled with champions, but there was something special about the 2016 Cubs that went beyond their statistical accomplishments. In the years since, the Cubs have continued to evolve. Some of the heroes of 2016 have moved on to other teams, part of the natural cycle that governs professional sports. New players have arrived, bringing their own talents and their own dreams. The organization has continued to emphasize player development and analytical approaches to the game, building for sustained success rather than short-term glory. But the memory of 2016 remains, preserved not just in record books and video highlights, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who witnessed it. That team proved that curses can be broken, that suffering can end, that sometimes, not often, but sometimes, good things happen to those who wait. Today, when you walk through Wrigleyville on a summer afternoon, you can feel the weight of all that history. The neighborhood has changed dramatically since the early days of the Cubs. Sleek, new apartment buildings rise where modest homes once stood, trendy restaurants have replaced corner taverns, and the rooftop seating that overlooks the ballpark has become big business. But Wrigley Field itself remains largely unchanged, a monument to baseball's capacity to connect us to our past while pointing us toward an uncertain future. The ivy still covers the outfield walls, though it's been replaced several times over the decades. The scoreboard still operates manually, though electronic components have been added to meet modern requirements. The warning track still has that particular crunch under a player's feet, a sound that has remained constant through more than a century of Cubs baseball. The Cubs' story is ultimately a story about time, how it passes, how it accumulates, how it transforms pain into wisdom and hope into memory. It's a story about the peculiar relationship between a city and its baseball team, how that relationship can sustain people through decades of disappointment, and how it can explode into pure joy when everything finally comes together. There are children today who will grow up knowing the Cubs as World Series champions, who will take that championship for granted in the way that children take all gifts for granted. They will never know what it felt like to be a Cubs fan in 1984 or 2003. Will never understand the particular pain of watching your team come so close to glory only to fall short. In some ways, this is a loss. They will miss out on the character-building experience of sustained disappointment, the way that suffering can deepen appreciation for joy. But they will also know something that several generations of Cubs fans never experienced: the feeling of watching your team win it all, of seeing dreams transform into reality, of being part of something larger than yourself that succeeds beyond your wildest expectations. They will carry that championship forward into their own adult lives, and when they have children and grandchildren, they will tell the story of 2016 as something they witnessed personally, as history they helped make simply by believing. The Chicago Cubs represent something essential about the American experience: the conviction that next year will be better than this year, that hope is always justified even when experience suggests otherwise, that loyalty and faith can be rewarded even if that reward comes later than we would prefer. They remind us that sports, at their best, are about more than winning and losing. They're about community and continuity, about the way that shared experiences can bind strangers together and create meaning out of what might otherwise be just another day. In the end, the Cubs' story is still being written. The championship of 2016 was not an ending, but a beginning. Not a destination, but a waypoint on a journey that continues with each new season. There will be more heartbreak and more glory, more seasons that fall short, and perhaps more that exceed all expectations. The curse is broken, but the story continues, shaped by new players and new fans and new dreams that are born with each spring training and die each October. And through it all, Wrigley Field will endure, ivy-covered and sunlit, a place where the past and present converge, and where the future remains forever possible. The Cubs will take the field 81 times a year, and their fans will fill the stands, carrying forward the hopes and memories of everyone who came before them. They will cheer and groan, and believe and doubt, participating in the ancient ritual that connects us to something larger than ourselves. This is the story of the Chicago Cubs. Not just a baseball team, but a repository for dreams, a keeper of traditions, a reminder that sometimes, if you wait long enough and believe hard enough, even the impossible can come true. Let's play two.